I call Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it's a great pleasure to rise and speak in support of this Members' Bill in the name of Dr Jackie Blue. And can I congratulate Dr Blue on bringing this bill to the House. It's an important issue in tough economic times. Making sure that consumers are protected is more important than ever, and I think it's there are both parts of this bill are areas where there is a genuine concern in the community. I've certainly heard it, and I know, and I'm sure others in this House will have. So we support this bill, and we will cooperate with it in the Select Committee. This bill will ensure, as Dr Blue has said, extended warranties will include more information about enforceable guarantees, ensure there is a cooling off period after purchasing an extended warranty, during which time a consumer can cancel that warranty and be entitled to a full refund. And that is important because far too many people are unnecessarily purchasing extended warranties and at often quite considerable cost. It also, as has been said, extends the general consumer protections to purchases made through websites such as Trade Me. And again, as Dr Blue has said, this is a significant amount of buying and selling that happens in this country is actually on Trade Me. So that's very important. It's important that consumer legislation is kept up to date. And I would note that this matter has been one that the Minister of Consumer Affairs, for example, talked about some considerable time ago, and as Labour's Consumer Affairs spokesperson, I heartily agreed with her at that time, but nothing has yet happened. So again, it's great to see Jackie Blue's work here. So we think this is a sensible bill that we should support, but it is an interesting point that this bill is being put out at a time, and they're quite specific amendments in this bill, they're being put up at a time when, of course, finally we have seen emerged the consumer law reform discussion paper just in the last day or so, and this has been the much hailed or awaited reform discussion document that the Minister of Consumer Affairs, the Honourable Heather Roy, has been talking about for some time, part of her one law, one door approach to consumer law. Now, we're going to take the same constructive approach to this review because consumer law is by its nature something that changes and can change quite rapidly. In fact, the requirements and needs of consumers can change quite quickly. But it is of interest to us that well, we're expecting the government will support Dr Blue's bill, and so they're prepared to advance some quite narrow amendments at a time that they are reviewing consumer law, but in fact seem to be indicating that they will be unwilling to support my bill, which looks at putting in some regulations at the what you might call the fringe end of the consumer market, the loan shark end of the consumer market, because they're doing a review of the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act, and in fact probably this review, and so therefore they can't possibly support the bill that I am sponsoring, which does seem to be somewhat of a double standard. And I would just put on record that, of course, during the term of this Parliament, I think you can look at Labour's voting record in relation to members' bills and see that we have not been petty and political about what bills we've supported, but in fact have supported bills on their merit. And that this is one, Amy Adams' bill is another, the bill by Simon Bridges in relation to animal welfare are some bills that come to mind. But anyway, as I say, we are supporting this bill and its intention to amend the Consumer Guarantees Act 1993 in relation to both extended warranties and the supply of goods and services by suppliers through a competitive bidding process using online trading. And it helps, well, both provisions are about assisting consumers to make informed decisions about purchasing, both in terms of extended warranties and also in terms of competitive bidding. And I think in relation to extended warranties, that cooling off period in which a consumer can change their mind and cancel the purchase and still receive a full refund is important. The reasons, as I say, that we're supporting this bill are because it's sensible. That's a good reason to support a bill. It is sensible and it meets an expressed need. It does, however, underline to me just how long it's taken the Minister of Consumer Affairs to get around to doing anything. So we have got, in fact, even members of the National Party getting sick of waiting for something to happen in the consumer area and having to put things up in a member's bill. And I think it's interesting indeed to see that happening. But as I say, I do acknowledge that finally emerging this week is the Consumer Law Reform discussion paper, and it's quite an extensive document, I have to say, and does indeed do what the Minister said she would do, which is go through most of the existing consumer law, the Fair Trading Act, the Consumer Guarantees Act, the Weight and Measures Act, Auctioneers Act, Door-to-Door Sales Act, one that definitely needs reviewing, I might add, one that I've been working on as well, the Lay-by Sales Act and the Unsolicited Goods and Services Act. Now, this will be very interesting to see how this process works and what people have to say, and I do hope that there is a real effort made to get extensive consultation on this document and lots of submissions, because certainly in terms of the review of the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act, despite this being an absolutely critically important area and with massive concern in terms of fringe lending, there were in fact only 55 submissions received on that particular review. And I understand it wasn't one that was actively promoted out in the public. It was quite a limited process in getting contributions to it, and I think that's a shame. So I do hope that in relation to the Minister's consumer law reform, that we do absolutely, all of us in this House, generate a lot of contributions to that review process. So I do think that I want to comment, not only has it taken 19 months for that review document to come out, or the discussion paper I should say, but the actual review of the CCCFA, the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act, took 9 months to come out. And despite the fact that submissions, the 55 submissions were received by the end of November, there's still actually no policy recommendations have emerged from the other end of that process either. So there is a need to make sure that we make progress in terms of consumer legislation. And I do wonder whether this Minister's heart is in it. But Dr Jackie Blue, on the other hand, hasn't sat by and waited for things to happen. She's got out there, done this Members' Bill and brought it to our House, and we're supporting her in that. And there is much change needed by consumers, and perhaps it's just worthwhile reflecting on the sorts of things that are needed, because, as I say, in tough economic times, the consequences of making poor consumer decisions can be very significant for families. And you can have situations where people don't know they're right. In fact, it's very common, and I'm sure that, in fact, across this House, we would share a concern about things like poor levels of financial literacy and lack of understanding of consumer rights. And the consequences, as I say, can be very, very significant for families. So improving consumer knowledge and protection is important, and that's, again, a good purpose of this bill. I think there's probably some work we need to do in the consumer area around vulnerable consumers in particular. There are people who, because of language barriers, low literacy, poverty, because they're older or younger, perhaps are not as well able to look after themselves. And we've seen some very sad cases. Just in the last week, I read a case of an elderly lady who was absolutely pressured into buying a completely unnecessary vacuum cleaner, completely traumatised by the whole experience, and in fact felt she was being physically intimidated by the salesperson. So there is much needed by consumers, particularly vulnerable consumers. And I do think we need to look at situations where there is exploitation happening, as is the case with loan sharks. Of course, updating our consumer law is also important because relationships in the consumer area change. And who would have thought the amount of trading that happens online? Who would have thought even maybe 3 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, it would have just been completely a surprise to people. From this side of the House, I think you can imagine that we want to see greater regulation in some areas, and certainly the loan sharks area, again, is an example